Revelations from top-secret Chernobyl archives show how Ukraine still blames the Soviet Union for the disaster. The Soviet KGB warned of an impending catastrophe. But the plant, lately on the front line of war, blew up all the same.
It was so easy to rip it apart at the time of the explosion.
The disaster at Chernobyl lies at the heart of Ukraine's struggle for independence from Russia. Troops battled over the abandoned site during Russia's invasion. And now, secret files reveal how the Soviets tried to cover up the disaster decades ago. How children were exposed to toxic fallout to pretend to the world that all was well.
До першотравневої демонстрації були залучені навіть діти.
The Soviets actually manipulated the weather, making a decision on where clouds of poison rain would fall.
Another decision was made, and that was keep it secret. The people were not told.
And the terrible human consequences of the world's worst nuclear disaster.
Я ждала его, я ждала несколько лет, чтобы забеременеть. И вдруг вот так вот я его отдам. Я просто не могла этого допустить.
The explosion inside Chernobyl nuclear reactor number 4 in April 1986 prompted frantic efforts to control the spread of deadly atomic fallout.
The steam that had built up inside of the reactor exploded, bursting a hole through the roof, and the energy and the heat inside of the fuel caused the graphite blocks inside of the reactor to set on fire.
The cloud of radioactive material quickly spread with the wind. It blanketed northern Poland before crossing the Baltic Sea to Sweden.
Countrywide radiation readings and samples have been flown into Stockholm for analysis. Human and animal milk was found to be contaminated, along with static water supplies.
For Vladimir Putin, a former member of the KGB, Chernobyl must be a painful reminder of the time when his country was at its weakest.
The shroud of secrecy of the Soviet Union crumbled with Chernobyl, and when that broke and started crumbling, that very much was the beginning of the end of the USSR.
Research in Kiev reveals the extent of that shroud of secrecy, when details of the disaster were deliberately suppressed. Formerly secret KGB documents show how the spy agency tried to cover up the effects of the Chernobyl fallout.
Співробітники Держбезпеки проводили профілактичну роботу із керівниками обласної київської лікарні, щоб вони взагалі цю інформацію не говорили.
Alla Shapiro was one of the doctors ordered to keep quiet as sick people arrived complaining of headache, nausea, and constant coughing.
Hundreds of people started coming to our hospital. We stayed at the hospital for 3 days and 3 nights, never went home. We were told we should not tell them that the air is filled with radioactive particles.
Newspapers in the West reported huge casualty figures. The Soviets said the death toll was not 2,000, but just 2 power plant workers. So who was telling the truth about the disaster? On May the 2nd, 6 days after the explosion, a secret telegram arrived on the desk of US Secretary of State George Shultz.
The entire intelligence community believes a fatality figure of 2 is preposterous.
The Reagan team confirmed world concern of what they claim is the Kremlin's continuing refusal to come clean.
The casualty rates are higher than those that have been announced by the Soviet Union so far. We don't think that they have provided as full and prompt information as they should have.
Mr. Reagan's attempts to discuss the situation with Mr. Gorbachev personally have been ignored by the Kremlin for 4 days.
Would you rather hear more from Mr. Gorbachev?
Yes, I think it would be helpful.
In London, the Soviet ambassador was confronted after briefing the Prime Minister.
Does it really seem likely that only 2 people have been killed in this, what has been an enormous
true.
disaster?
You know, that's official report.
Remarkably, on this occasion, the Soviets had been telling the truth.
The Soviets were absolutely correct saying that there were 2 people that died as the result of the accident per se. The explosion itself indeed killed just 1 person, and another died a few days later. The 2000 figure came from a Western reporter who met a woman from Kiev, and that's what she told him.
KGB agents were now ordered to keep reporters and locals apart. A formerly secret report reads,
"There are 16 foreign correspondents in Kiev. Attempts by correspondents from England, France, and Sweden to collect biased information at the Kiev railway station were thwarted by use of a special KGB undercover squad."
Meanwhile, 7 days after the explosion, the crisis was entering a phase which could make those huge casualty figures a reality. It was feared that tons of intensely hot molten material underneath the twisted wreckage could ignite a further vast explosion. Some scientists feared that if the nuclear fuel burned through the concrete floor to reach water tanks below, then a nuclear explosion would occur. One estimate said the blast could equal 5 million tons of TNT, 400 times more powerful than the Hiroshima atom bomb. Someone needed to enter the pitch-black reservoir chamber and open the water valves. To venture so close to the exposed reactor, wading through radioactive water was considered almost a suicide mission. Alexei Ananenko was a mechanical engineer who knew the layout of the valves and pipes concerned. Along with 2 colleagues, he agreed to go in.
Ну, я понял, почему мне позвонили, потому что знали, что я туда ходил периодически. А так мы спустились, а вижу, там вода. То есть не просто ходить, а вода. Ну и понятно, что эта вода, она как-то будет действовать на людей. Хотя у нас было все закрыто, на самом деле все мгновенно вышло. Мы открыли, и вода стала уходить вниз. Ну и все, и мы вернулись обратно.
The risk of explosion was averted. Alexei's story gave rise to one of the great myths about Chernobyl. That all 3 men died soon afterwards and were instantly buried in lead coffins. In fact, all 3 survived. Their heroism was recognized with the award of Hero of Ukraine. So, is he a hero?
Это очень хороший вопрос. Ну, я делал то, что положено мне делать. Я это прошел. Вот и все на этом.
Alexei Ananenko knew the risks he was running to prevent an explosion. But thousands of Soviet citizens had no idea that their health was deliberately put at risk by their leaders. It happened during a top-secret mission to protect the Soviet capital, Moscow. And the plan sounds like something from science fiction. The city of Moscow lies 700 kilometers northeast of Chernobyl. The story of how it was protected from Chernobyl fallout was buried for years. But then, a British scientist noticed something very odd about where the fallout had landed. Dr. Alan Flowers is an expert on the effects of radiation in the environment. In 1992, he traveled to the former Soviet Union to investigate why an area far from Chernobyl had been especially affected by nuclear fallout.
When they showed me the maps, why is there all this fallout? Nearly 200 kilometers away. Very high levels of radioactivity. Oh, don't you understand? The Soviet Union made it rain.
A British scientist became suspicious over the mysterious way that fallout was dispersed after the Chernobyl explosion. He consulted local researchers and a remarkable story unfolded. Soon after the explosion, winds that had been driving the cloud of fallout to the northwest suddenly veered towards the northeast. That put Moscow, home to nearly 10 million citizens and the Soviet leadership, in danger from clouds releasing nuclear-contaminated rain. But Moscow could be spared if the clouds could be made to release their rain before they reached the city. This was the answer the Soviets came up with. This film, from the 1960s, shows an early demonstration of cloud seeding, spreading frozen carbon dioxide or dry ice from an aircraft to turn fluffy white clouds into true rain clouds.
Cloud seeding is the process of cooling and chilling. Then you'll get condensation, you'll get droplets heavy, they will fall out of the cloud. And my goodness, it does work.
For the Soviet top brass, the plan had to work. Chernobyl blew up on April the 26th. Only 5 days later, the Soviet national holiday, May Day, would see hundreds of thousands out on the streets of Moscow for the annual parade in Red Square. All the usual preparations had already been made. To cancel the giant parade would be like admitting to the world that Russia was beaten. No photographs of the secret operation exist. But it's likely the Soviets used bomber aircraft like these to spray the clouds with huge quantities of dry ice. Eyewitnesses watched the planes at work.
You can't fly aeroplanes and do cloud seeding without people seeing it. But they didn't understand what they were seeing at the time. Planes flying and streams coming out of them. And of course, a very intense rain for days and black fallout coming. This is what was described as the black rain, but you don't feel the radioactivity, you don't smell it, you don't see it. No human sense picks that up.
Moscow's May Day parade went ahead under clear skies, while areas to the southwest were lashed by torrential and poisonous rain.
Now, of course, we know where the fallout ended up, because I've been there. I've measured it. And there are areas still out of use, still evacuated. It's not an easy decision to make. Do you induce artificial rain on areas of low population, or let nature take its course and risk major effects on your capital city? A difficult decision. However, another decision was made, and that was keep it secret. The people were not told.
The May Day parade went off safely for the people of Moscow. In Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, things turned out differently. As a doctor, Alla Shapiro had already seen dozens of patients with breathing difficulties. She sensed the problem herself.
Outside on the street, while walking, I first had this burning sensation in my mouth and in my ears. And then I had this metallic, very unpleasant taste.
But the KGB files show how Communist Party leaders in Moscow ordered the parade in Kiev to take place, as a demonstration to the world that all was well, despite the accident at Chernobyl. The KGB assured their bosses.
Preparations for the celebration of May the 1st are taking place in an exceptionally healthy political environment.
The Soviet government was trying to project that picture that everything is under control. For the TV, for the cameras, the people and their health were certainly expendable.
The officer then in charge of medical affairs for the Ukrainian KGB says he highlighted the risks of the parade, but was overruled.
Мне как по должностным обязанностям пришлось тоже быть там, потому что я обязан там был быть. Вот. И я понимал, что это катастрофа серьезная.
I witnessed that parade because we lived in the center of the city, and this parade just passed the building where my family lived. They followed the direct instructions from the government, like nothing happened. Everything is good, stay outdoors, and that's what they did.
The KGB files reveal the dangers faced by even the most vulnerable.
В цьому документі йдеться про те, що діти виступали у відповідних костюмах, які потім певний час зберігалися у одній із шкіл Києва. То радянські спецслужби доповідали про те, що ці костюми випромінюють певний радіоактивний фон, що треба щось із цим робити, або ж його дезактивувати, або, по суті, знищити.
Что происходило в государственных коридорах власти, там, в Центральном комитете партии, в Верховном Совете, конечно, мне не было известно, но я абсолютно знал точно, что наш комитет представил все данные о истинном состоянии дела, что это ядерная катастрофа, и просил все-таки отменить решение о проведении парада. Было такое, абсолютно я знаю эти данные.
Soon, the doctors had even more sick children to treat.
They're all coughing because they inhaled radioactive particles. So we just grabbed blankets and we created the artificial tent. And we put kids under the tent, brought oxygen. Of course, it was like 19th century invention, but it did work.
But some of the effects would not emerge until years later.
Children are very sensitive to radioactive iodine. 6 years from the exposure, the rate of thyroid cancer was dramatically increased.
May Day 1986 is etched into the memory of one person in particular. Marina Sivets was 25 years old at the time of the accident and 5 months into her first pregnancy. Her husband was a metal worker at the power plant. Marina lived in Pripyat, the city which was specially built for the 5,000 Chernobyl workers and their families. A community of 50,000 in total. "36 hours after the explosion, Pripyat was evacuated and has lain abandoned ever since. Marina went to stay with her in-laws 400 kilometers to the south. She went for a checkup at the local hospital, and the doctor's response was chilling.
Пришел доктор, посмотрел и говорит, вот сейчас готовится операционная, будем вызывать роды искусственные. Вот я просто была в ужасе. Какие роды? Что значит вызывать искусственные роды? Он говорит, ну вы же видите, перевоз зашкаливает, у вас радиации внутри много, ребенка оставлять нельзя, потому что могут быть последствия. Ну, я просто представила, не подумала, а просто представила. Вот ребенок, 5 месяцев, уже сформированный. Они его достанут по частям. Что они с ним будут делать? Эксперименты потом будут делать. Я очень хотела этого ребенка. Я ждала его. Я ждала несколько лет, чтобы забеременеть. И вдруг вот так вот я его отдам. Я просто не могла этого допустить. Когда он ушел и закрыл меня с коридора на застежку, хорошо, что это был первый этаж. А муж под окнами ходил с тем кульком, с одеждой. Я окно открыла, говорю, давай бегом, пока они сейчас не вернулись, потому что он любую минуту, врач может вернуться в палату. И мы бегом побежали на автостанцию и уехали к его родителям. А на следующий день, 1 мая, все красивые, нарядные, отмечают праздник. А к нам едет милиция с сигнальной, с маячком, потому что из областного управления милиции поступила радиограмма, что такая-то, такая-то сбежала из больницы, найти и вернуть ее.
On May the 1st, 1986, the streets of Kiev are filled with children breathing in dangerous nuclear fallout following the Chernobyl explosion 5 days earlier. Police are hunting for 25-year-old Marina Sivets, on the run and determined to protect her unborn baby. Despite the efforts of the KGB to play down the disaster, Western media report that already thousands of people have died. But what was the true picture? In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, workers and first responders absorbed huge amounts of radiation from exposed uranium fuel and graphite blocks which had been packed into the reactor core.
There are a number of ways that radiation impacts the human body. The problem at Chernobyl was that there were all of these types of radiation at the same time. Alpha particles, they're quite big and heavy and they can cause damage inside of your tissue. Beta particles are high-energy electrons. These are able to strip your DNA. Gamma radiation is extremely penetrating. It will travel through all organic matter. And this really interrupts your DNA and starts to break it down.
Chernobyl worker Mykola Gorbachenko was on duty the night of the explosion. As the disaster unfolded, he sought out casualties and carried them to safety. Before long, Mikola himself began to feel the effects of radiation exposure.
Вот, зашел, разделся, зашел в душ, помыться. В душе мне немножко плохо стало, как бы терять сознание стал. Товарищ, который меня знал, друг знали, подхватили меня, вынесли на лавочку.
Outside, firefighter Petro Khmel was battling to control the blaze on the roof of the reactor building.
Вот, по крыше парень там один говорит, пожарный говорит, мне что-то плохо, тошнота. Вот, говорю, ну спускайся на низ, жди возле машины. Вот. Потом второй подходит, мне тоже тошнота, как-то такая слабость. Ну, они спустились на низ, я остался один. Ну и все. И я чувствую, что слабо, и так, ноги подкосило.
A lot of the firefighters said that they could taste metal. This was highly radioactive graphite that they were ingesting into their bodies.
Просинаюсь в больнице, смотрю так, думаю, где я нахожусь.
Mikola and Petro were both flown to Moscow, where radiation specialists had gathered at the city's hospital number 6. Soon, other visitors began to arrive.
Служба безопасности КГБ в Москве в больнице. Допросы устраивали, все, записывали все, что это. Ну, версии были, что это диверсия какая-то, еще что-то, что видел, что где был, что это самое. Я рассказывал там одному КГБисту, так он все зафиксировал.
Приехал брат родной, жена приехала. Поставили столик, стоял, 4 стулья. Зашел 2 КГБиста. Ну, брат говорит, вот у нас там в Киеве вино дают, там водку, вот я ему привез 3-4 бутылки вина. Ну, показывайте. Он берет дипломат, если кто знает, такие черные дипломаты, ложит на стол, он посмотрел. Так, 3 бутылки забираем. Раз, забираешь. Потом смотрит так на меня, говорит, да ему это не нужна бутылка. И 4-ю забрали, полностью чемоданом.
Here's where began one of the most intriguing episodes of the late Cold War. When a medic from California turned up at Moscow Hospital number 6, beginning a game of cat and mouse with the KGB.
I've heard it said that I was the greatest spy to come into the Soviet Union in recent years.
Chernobyl caused huge embarrassment not just for the Soviets, but also for America's CIA. A giant nuclear explosion had occurred in Europe, only 2 hours flight time from Berlin. And they knew nothing about it for nearly 3 days. A top-secret memo reads,
We are especially disturbed because it occurred right in the heart of NATO's warning of war domain. We need to find out why.
It was a major intelligence failure on the part of the CIA and other intelligence agencies in the West.
But the same CIA document goes on to spot a possible opportunity.
We shall want to derive intelligence from any Western organizations, including those contributing to medical needs.
Learning how well the Soviets were coping could provide priceless intelligence on their ability to survive a wartime nuclear strike. Gaining permission even to enter the Soviet Union was the first challenge facing Robert Gale, a cancer specialist at UCLA Medical Center. He called an American oil tycoon with Kremlin contacts going back many decades.
My first move was to call Dr. Armin Hammer He had been going back and forth to the Soviet Union since the time of Lenin.
Hammer spoke with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. On May the 2nd, Dr. Gale arrived in Moscow.
We brought in machines for collecting blood cells, expertise in doing bone marrow transplants. You know, we had done many thousands, and we were able to bring in some drugs.
All of us that work in this field are well aware.
The mere arrival of this American doctor, who seemed to have brushed aside the Iron Curtain, was big news for the Soviet people.
I can tell you that as a person who lived at that time in the Soviet Union, that the message of hope that visit sent to me helped to live through those very, very difficult weeks when I had to keep my children indoors, when I didn't know what was going on. The real impact of Dr. Gale's presence in the Soviet Union was really a sign that the Soviet Union was opening up. There was a sign of hope.
But inevitably, the doctor was kept under close surveillance by the KGB. His conversations were monitored and recorded in the KGB's secret archive.
Mr. Gale tried to find out the total number of people evacuated from the area of the accident, the number of patients, as well as the degree of their radiation damage.
In a veiled reference to bugged telephone lines, the KGB give their target the all clear.
According to the operational data, the American specialist showed no dissatisfaction.
Knowing that I was being followed, I'm not surprised to read this. I pity the poor people who had to listen to hours and hours and hours of my conversation in the Sovietskaya Hotel. This might be worse than the Gulag. Who knows?
Dr. Gale helped treat some of the 200 most severely affected by radiation. Among the 28 who died were 6 firefighter colleagues of Petro Chmel.
Заходит врач и показывает мне газета «Известия». И это было 6 пожарных. Вот. И она говорит, их больше нет. Никакого общения с нами, с ними я не имел. Только по газете узнал, что их нету.
Petro eventually regained his health and was rewarded for his bravery at Chernobyl. Marina Sivit's brief time in hospital had been every bit as traumatic. Threatened with an enforced abortion, though 5 months pregnant, after she made her escape, she laid low, protected by members of her husband's family.
Пока, в общем-то, не позвонили его двоюродному брату, а он замначальника милиции районной, и не сказали, соседнего района, и не сказали, что передай своим родственникам, пусть не бегают и не прячутся. Мы их и в 3 часа ночи, с постели подымем. Зачем это бегать? Тогда мы решили, что, действительно, мы же от них все равно не убежим. Будем сдаваться, но с условием. Ни о каких родах там искусственных, ни о каких абортах речи быть не будет. Не может быть. Я написала заявление, что там понимаю всю ответственность и добровольно принимаю решение уйти. И тогда уже меня отпустили. В сентябре, 7 сентября родился Артем. Хороший, нормальный, 250 килограмм, 53 сантиметра. Такой богатырчик, славный, хороший мальчик. Ручки, ножки, все на месте, все как и положено. Конечно, это счастье, это радость, это неописуемое.
Marina had beaten the cops and the doctors. But today, other children of Chernobyl still suffer the effects of the campaign of secrecy. Before the explosion at Chernobyl, the KGB's warnings of a possible disaster were routinely ignored.
These defects can lead to accidents in the future. Radioactive particles have been discovered 5 kilometers away from the plant. The design of the reactor also does not provide for a safety containment.
After the explosion, a senior officer now maintains warnings about the health effects were also pushed aside.
Мы говорили правду. Единственное, что мы не могли, комитет госбезопасности не был всесилен. Понимаете?
The historian who has worked through the huge KGB Chernobyl dossier says that, as the old Soviet Union entered its terminal decline, there were signs that people everywhere were losing their fear of the once all-powerful spy agency. Virtually unprecedented in Soviet society, demonstrations began to erupt out on the streets.
Він відбувся в одну із річниць по Чорнобильській трагедії, це у квітні 1988 року, і цей мітинг було розігнано радянськими спецслужбами. Люди просто-напросто перестали боятися владу, перестали боятися радянських спецслужб.
Chernobyl hit just as the Soviet Union had promised to be more open and honest with the rest of the world. But following up on that proved tough.
Mr. Gorbachev tackled me in his office in a very unpleasant moment. He asked me, well, why are American and European newspapers saying all these terrible things? I said, well, you know, we have a free press, Mr. Gorbachev. Our governments don't control what newspapers say.
The habit of controlling the flow of information had grave consequences.
I have a first-hand comment from Mikhail Gorbachev. I asked him, what was his biggest problem at the time of Chernobyl? And the answer I got personally from him was getting the information. Mikhail Gorbachev was being shielded from a lot of the information. Everything is okay.
Yet people the world over worried about the consequences as Chernobyl spewed radioactive material into the air.
What about the long-term effects? More and more cancers in Europe?
Yes, I think we have to face for certain that there will be an increased incidence of leukemia and cancer.
After more than 30 years, there's nothing approaching a consensus on how much illness was caused by Chernobyl. An estimate from Greenpeace says more than 90,000 fatal cancers. The World Health Organization says maybe 4,000 over an 80-year period. But according to one highly respected group of scientists, even for those who came into closest contact with the radioactive debris, the main danger was psychological rather than physical. The Chernobyl Tissue Bank has been collecting medical data and samples for more than 20 years.
The biggest health consequence had been one of mental issues brought on by all the worry of being exposed to radiation. The actual physical interaction did way less damage.
Partly because the KGB clamped down on the spread of information, thousands of children absorbed radioactive iodine from milk or simply from the air, and later developed thyroid cancer. These patients in Kiev were children at the time of the disaster.
Врачи говорят, что да, вполне могло быть связано, что Луганск — это как раз та зона, которая находилась недалеко от этого от Чернобыля. И, собственно, очень много случаев, таких, как у меня.
You know, fortunately, thyroid cancer is readily treatable. So we have very few deaths from that.
Thyroid cancer has a survival rate exceeding 90%. There's uncertainty over whether Chernobyl has caused a spike in other forms of the disease, cancer of the blood, or other forms known as solid cancers.
We have very little evidence of an increase in cancers in what is now the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries.
Doctors at the Chernobyl Tissue Bank are even more emphatic.
The results so far suggest there is no increase in solid cancer at all.
The controversy over the health effects from Chernobyl began just days after the explosion and has never gone away. The fear of the poison cloud was very real.
We estimate that there were about 1 million abortions done in Europe because of women being counseled by their physicians that there might be a danger of birth defects. And this is absolutely nonsense, but that ignorance has led to, you know, tragic consequences.
There's no consensus either on how the environment has suffered. 2,600 square kilometers remain an exclusion zone, designated too dangerous for human habitation. Yet the absence of humans has seen an extraordinary influx of wildlife. Stanislav Humenyuk is a researcher monitoring the return of species which appear to thrive inside the exclusion zone.
Існує дуже багато міфів, особливо чомусь серед іноземців, що природа мутує, і тут можна знайти всяких там чудовиськ з 2 головами, з 3-5 лапами, 5 хвостами і так далі. Ну, це нелогічно, хто трошечки розуміється в цивілізаційних процесах, взагалі в еволюції, розвитку.
Camera traps have picked up the private lives of species driven out of much of Europe. Including rarely seen predators, wolves and lynx.
Ні, токсична радіація, вона не вплинула. Тварини відчужені. Якщо бути так трошки навіть цинічним, вона навіть посприяла тому, що в середині Європи, в серці Європи, величезна територія віддана дикій природі, де природа просто розвивається по своїм законам, а не по законам людини.
The animals now rule the area from which more than 300,000 people were removed for their own safety. But a few people decided to ignore the rules. Hanna Zavarotnya, 88 years old, is one of roughly 200 lifetime inhabitants who decided to stay. Life is simple, and she eats what she grows.
А це малина, да, тут клубники ріденько, а там багато у мене клубників, на тому городі там багато. Повернулися, що це родина. Тут мій пуп закопаний, як хрестили мене, розумієте? Люди поворочуються і кажуть, проклятий буде, хто буде шукати добра. Де ти родився, туди треба поворочуватися, розумієте?
During her lifetime, Hannah has seen the KGB rise and fall. The spy agency, which first expressed alarm at the dangers presented by Chernobyl, then followed orders to try to keep the disaster under wraps, went the way of the entire Soviet Union. The KGB was dissolved in 1991. Its huge top-secret archive on Chernobyl has remained hidden for 3 decades. The remains of Chernobyl reactor building number 4 are now encased in a giant steel chamber. What goes on inside the structure? To painstakingly dismantle and remove the wreckage of the reactor, parts of which will remain lethally radioactive for thousands of years. The power plant is called Chernobyl only as a form of shorthand. Its official designation was the Vladimir Lenin nuclear plant, named for the Soviet revolutionary hero. At the time of the disaster, Ukraine had more than 5,000 Lenin statues, but destroyed nearly all of them. One was retained in the small town of Chernobyl itself, not as a tribute, but a backhanded reminder of how the Soviet Union made this piece of the planet infamous for all time.